Today we're going to read a bit of portrait using Wayne Booth's essay on irony as our guide. Booth's essay is pretty old by now. In fact, it's considered a classic, but he highlights some of the things that make reading portrait challenging, whether you buy his overall argument or not. We're going to start by looking at the passage at the end of chapter 2, when Stephen first goes to visit the prostitute. I'm looking at a paragraph on page 101 in my book, 7 paragraphs from the end, beginning, "He had wandered." Let's read just this paragraph out loud, and then look for places where there are unusual elements, things that are asking for explanation. He had wandered into a maze of narrow and dirty streets. From the foul laneways he heard bursts of hoarse riot and wrangling, and the drawling of drunken singers. He walked onward, undismayed, wondering whether he had strayed into the quarter of the Jews. Women and girls dressed in long, vivid gowns traversed the street from house to house. They were leisurely and perfumed. A trembling seized him, and his eyes grew dim. The yellow glass flames arose before his troubled vision against the vapory sky, burning as if before an altar. Before the doors and in the lighted halls, groups were gathered, arrayed as if for some rite. He was in another world. He had awakened from a slumber of centuries. Okay, first, let's just ground ourselves in the basic reality of the text. What Stephen is doing here is visiting the red light district of his town, the place where he can expect to find a prostitute to sleep with him. Given that, there is much here that is strange. First, it's not particularly weird that the streets in this part of town are narrow and dirty. Generally speaking, red light districts are located in rundown and neglected parts of town, not necessarily far from central business districts, but definitely showing the city's neglect of citizens it considers unworthy of protection and support. What is weird is that Stephen wonders if he has strayed into the quarter of the Jews. Dublin did not have such a thing. This is something Stephen has picked up from his reading of romantic adventure stories like The Count of Monte Cristo. Now look at what happens when he sees the women of this area. He perceives them as exotic, not as fellow Dubliners like him. His description of the gowns, his use of the word perfumed as a way to delineate them, even things like saying they traversed the street rather than crossing it or walking along it, all aim to make them seem foreign and alluring. The effect of this on Stephen is to make him tremble and to dim his eyes. For Stephen, this is surely an erotic excitement, but the way it comes out is this rather romantic, bookish statement. When he describes the yellow gas flames, which are the street lights and house lights, the most common form of street lighting at this time in Dublin, he doesn't see their everyday use, but instead says they are burning as if before an altar. This is not an altar of the religion he was raised in. It is something exotic, as marked by the fact that the people standing in the doorways, sex workers and their customers, are arrayed as for some rite. Stephen himself thinks that he is no longer in the ordinary Dublin he knows so well. He thinks he is in another world, and that he has awakened from a slumber of centuries. Given that he's about 15 or 16 years old here, I feel pretty confident in saying that this is some kind of artsy exaggeration. So, would you say this passage is ironic? Remember, in this class, the answer is almost always yes to that question. What are some of the markers that make us feel assured in our opinion? Does Stephen's effort to make this a grander, more novel-worthy event, an effort that the narrator translates for us as he focalizes the narrative intensely from Stephen's point of view, give us the clue that irony is at work here? Now let's skip down a bit to where Stephen is in the room with the prostitute. He describes her room as warm and lightsome, misusing the word lightsome. It means merry and carefree. You would use it to describe a dancing person maybe, but not a room. Why do you think the narrator, focalizing through Stephen and deploying the Uncle Charles principle, uses this word? I can guarantee that James Joyce knows the proper usage. In the description of the room, There's a huge doll that sits with her legs apart in the copious easy chair beside the bed. I'm just going to put that down as a strange detail as well. Dolls in that day were either rag dolls or porcelain, and if porcelain, the legs would be stiff, so putting the doll in a sitting position would splay the legs. But what is the prostitute doing with a doll in her room at all? It suggests that she is very young indeed. It's unpleasant to think about, but sex work was common in Dublin at this time for structural reasons. British soldiers were garrisoned in the city, so there was plenty of demand for sex workers' services. But women at the time also had few ways to earn money. This problem was particularly acute for young unmarried girls, who left school generally not later than age 14, and who had to turn over any wages they earned from working to their fathers. They were typically kept very short of spending money, and so many of them turned to at least occasional prostitution as a way of bringing in some cash income for their needs. This detail, especially combined with the attempt in the paragraph we just looked at to make this adventure exotic, like something out of Stephen's favorite novels, makes me think that Stephen has mixed feelings about what he's doing. He's excited, but also he's seeing a little of the humanity of the girl he's about to have sex with, and what he sees doesn't make him feel like he's the romantic prince he would like to imagine himself to be. And sure enough, he thinks he should speak to her, but he cannot. Moving on, Stephen finds his discombobulation increasing. Let's look at the paragraph beginning, "As he stood silent." As he stood silent in the middle of the room, she came over to him and embraced him gaily and gravely. Her round arms held him firmly to her, and he, seeing her face lifted to him in serious calm and feeling the warm calm rise and fall of her breast, all but burst into hysterical weeping. Tears of joy and relief shone in his delighted eyes, and his lips parted, though they would not speak. This is an image of two children together. The girl's round arms signal childish chubbiness, and Stephen's hysterical weeping suggests the same thing. In this case, of course, the young prostitute is much more experienced than Stephen, which the narrator signals to us by describing her twice as calm. The final sentence of the paragraph suggests that Stephen is delighted, but none of the other evidence in the text backs up that assertion, particularly his inability to speak to her, although he wants to. Now, we can ask again, how is this passage ironic? What's happening in this paragraph between the plot action and the words the narrator uses to describe that action that we might take ironically? Let's move now to the last two paragraphs of the chapter. Here we have Stephen's inability to speak, to move, to respond to her in any way. While he is paralyzed and incapable of speech, the narrator tells us in her arms he felt that he had suddenly become strong and fearless and sure of himself. Do we believe this? The very next line is, but his lips would not bend to kiss her. Let's stop for a minute and talk about fragmentation. We know that this is a key technique of modernism, and here in this passage, actually going back a few paragraphs, we have been seeing examples of fragmented human bodies. The young girl, for instance, that was characterized narratively as calm in the earlier paragraph, is actually some body parts that are each individually calm, her uplifted face and her breast. For Stephen, what won't speak or bend to kiss are his lips, as if lips had their own volition and could choose what to do or not do. In the final paragraph of the passage, the girl's lips pressed upon his brain, which I can promise lips cannot do. So part of Stephen's response, then, is to break up his experience into little bits that are more comprehensible to him, more amenable to the control he would like to be able to exert on his body overall. Remember, at the beginning of Portrait, we talked about Stephen doing a quick partitioning of the senses between his mother and father, who at that point represented to him the two kinds of people, men and women. Stephen associates the eye and seeing with his father and masculinity, and this is pretty typical in patriarchal culture. Men look at women, but women don't look at men. See the entire history of Western painting for proof. He associates all other senses with his mother: smell, touch, hearing, taste. Stephen divides human beings into two groups. One sees and narrates and controls, and the other feels, smells, hears, and tastes. For Stephen, women are creatures of the body, and men are creatures of the mind. So here, at a moment when he is about to have sex for the first time, he has a real problem. How can he experience what he so wants to experience unless he is in his body? This explains his strange passivity during the encounter. He can only imagine being in the body and feeling what he feels as a fundamentally feminine act. He had imagined that having sex would make him a man. Instead, because of his wacky ideas about gender, he is becoming a woman. I could ask again how this is ironic, but I think, ironically, that question is a bit too obvious. So let's turn to Wayne Booth. Booth writes that what makes portraits so difficult to understand is its lack of warning that irony is at work, complexity, subtlety, or privacy of norms, and vivid psychological realism. Try to apply Booth's conjecture to each of the paragraphs we've just examined. When is the lack of warning of irony at work? When can we see the complexity, subtlety, or privacy of norms? And how does vivid psychological realism hamper us? Now let's ask a different question. What would you add to Booth's list? Just looking at the passages we've just studied, what else is going on in Joyce's work that makes interpretation difficult?